Over the past 3 sessions, we've been exploring the most famous and well-known of the Crusades, the Crusades to the Holy Lands. And these Crusades were a pivotal moment in the history of Christianity in Europe and the Holy Land, and have far-reaching consequences right down to the modern day. Now, to recap, some of the key points I've been trying to bring out over those sessions has been that the Crusades were, at least for the nobility who led them, not entirely about religion, but often about power and prestige, secular authority, freedom, wealth, and renown. And even for the masses, religion was not always the only factor. A longing to escape from the terrible living conditions and the potential of plunder and food were important as well. Across Europe, the Crusades to the Holy Lands led to the killing of thousands and thousands of Jews and Christians, even before they reached the Holy Land. Some Crusades were led by men who were excommunicated by the Pope. Others defied the Pope and attacked other Christian kingdoms, often with catastrophic consequences in the long run, like the destruction of Constantinople. Some of the most successful Crusades never fought a single battle, but used diplomacy to achieve their goal. Despite their often singular vision on the surface, the Crusades were often fought against one another, and their success largely depended on infighting among the Muslim powers as well. A simple Christian West versus Muslim East is just a fantasy. In other words, the Crusades, though such impactful events in the world history of forming religious and national identity to this day, were actually much more complex than we often give them credit for. And this is a truth that I want to continue to focus on today as we look at some of the more forgotten Crusades, those in Spain and those in the Baltic region. We're going to cover quite a lot of history during this time in 2 very different parts of Europe, so I wouldn't worry too much about specific dates and names, although you may want to write them down for your own intellect and knowledge, but more think about the general trends and the long-lasting implications that these events have had on Europe and nations right down to this day. Now, the use of the term crusade for the events in Iberia, that is modern-day Spain and Portugal, is rather difficult. They were certainly specific moments and periods when crusades were called, and eventually specific crusader orders of militant Christians such as the Templars and Hospitallers were involved, as well as the 4 main militant Spanish orders such as the Knights of Santiago. But overall, the Christian conquest of Iberia, or Reconquest, is better understood as a long, hard, and in the most part secular conflict. This conflict, spanning from about 711 to 1492, that's 781 years, is too complex to deal with in depth, but I will give an outline and some key takeaway points along the way. Let's take a step back to before the rise of Islam. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula was controlled by the Visigoths. Now, you may recall that name from earlier lectures because the Visigoths were an Arian group. They were heretics who believed that the Son of God was a creation of the Father and not eternally God. And this was true up until 587, when the Visigothic king renounced Arianism and embraced Catholicism and the authority of the Pope. The Visigothic kingdom through this period was never really at peace though. The south was conquered by the Byzantines under Emperor Justinian the Great and had to be slowly recaptured. And then when that was done, there was conflict with the expanding power of the Franks from the north. Alongside this was the constant rebelling and tensions in the north of the Iberian Peninsula among the Basques and other people groups, and of course internal struggles between various dynasties causing civil wars. And all of that conflict made the Iberian Peninsula weak. And when the Muslims rocked up and invaded in 711, they made rapid gains, and by 716 had conquered all of the peninsula except for a small mountainous region called Asturias in the very north. Now, the Muslims didn't stop in Iberia. They crossed the Pyrenees in 719 and conquered along the southern coast for a while of modern-day France before heading north. In 720 they suffered essentially the very first defeat in this whole conquest when they were pushed back from advancing north at the Battle of Toulouse. They attacked again with greater force the following year, only to be defeated at long last by our old friend Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in 732. Now, whilst the Muslim forces were being occupied in modern-day France, the first victory against them in Iberia itself had occurred, when a rebel from the Asturias region in the north named Pelagius won the first victory against them at Covadonga in 722. That battle is widely believed to begin what is known as the Reconquista. The reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. The Reconquista didn't just involve the Spanish though. In 778, Charlemagne, another character we're familiar with, crossed the Pyrenees at the request of a local Muslim lord who wanted help against those who were above him. This was not a religious decision. The motives of the Asturians was hardly purely about religion either. They expanded their control not just against the Muslims to the south, but against the other Christian kingdoms in the north which had survived the Muslim invasions. But religion certainly was a factor, and we would be kidding ourselves if we said that it wasn't. In 792, the Emir of Cordoba called a jihad against the kingdom of Asturias in the north and the Franks of modern-day southern France. Though the jihad won many battles, it ultimately failed, and the Franks crossed the Pyrenees, the city of Barcelona fell, and Charlemagne set up vassal kingdoms across the Pyrenees, some of which would later ally with Muslims to overthrow their Frankish overlords. The Christian kingdoms in the north would eventually solidify into the kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon and Portugal. Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon and Portugal. The marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon to Isabella of Castile in 1469 would create the modern state of Spain as we know it. But it's important to note that these Christian kingdoms were never really united against the Muslims, who themselves were rarely united and went through numerous periods of civil war, at which times they were being run by much smaller regional warlords. Examples of this kind of thing include how the kingdoms of Leon and Castile allied together to defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Simancas in 939, but then were engaged in a war against each other only 5 years later, the result of which led to the Kingdom of Leon agreeing a peace treaty with the Muslims. In 1195, the King of Castile was crushed in a battle against the Muslims, and the King of Castile took this as an opportunity to invade his rival Christian kingdom. The King of Leon took this as an opportunity to invade his rival Christian kingdom. And so he allied with the Muslims and invaded Castile. This led to Portugal attacking Leon and calling on the Pope to call a crusade against the Christian kingdom of Leon, which he did, and which eventually led to the downfall of Leon and it being taken over by the kingdom of Castile. Christians during the Reconquista can thus be seen to often form alliances with the Muslims, and Christian mercenaries, including the famous El Cid, often fought for Muslims against other Christians. The kings and power holders of the various kingdoms often had secular matters at the forefront of their minds, whilst the powerful military orders, like the Templars and Knights of Santiago, often had religious matters at the forefront of theirs. Whilst the secular rulers were often happy to deal with the Muslims and opposed raiding and unnecessary violence, the militant orders were more than happy to massacre men, women and children if they weren't Christian, and saw any parley with Muslims as evil. This more moderate position of the secular rulers, especially at first, was important because what they desired most was control and power. The bottom line was that unlike in the Holy Land, where in many places Christians were still the majority, in Iberia in the 11th century, about 80% of people were Muslim. Christians only made up 15% of the population, with Jews being the other 5%. Apart from paying the jizya tax, Christians were generally well treated throughout this period, though the Jews under Muslim rule did often face periods of intense persecution. All of this fairly okay well-being for Christians, and often for Jews, under the Muslims changed in the late 1140s when new Muslim rulers, the Almohads, took over. The Almohads were much more fanatical and fundamentalist in their understanding of Islam, and they treated Christians and Jews very harshly, which led to most of them fleeing their lands. But bear in mind, it was these more fundamentalist Muslims that Leon was willing to ally with to try and take out the rival Christian kingdom of Castile. Sadly, the Christians cannot be said to really have been any more moderate once they had control of the peninsula in 1492. When this happened and all of Iberia was finally under Christian control, all the Jews were expelled, 200,000 people expelled, and in the early 1500s it became compulsory to become a Roman Catholic under pain of torture and death, and enter the Spanish Inquisition. I bet no one expected that. Founded in 1478, its original purpose was to maintain the doctrinal orthodoxy and correctness of the Church, but without having to answer to the Pope, but rather to the Spanish crowns. The Spanish Inquisition was thus largely occupied with making sure that the Muslims and Jews who were forced to convert actually had done so and didn't continue to practice their religion in secret. Later, it would be responsible for rooting out Protestants as well. It also policed marriages, homosexual acts, child abuse, child neglect, incense, tax fraud, smuggling, espionage, treason. Basically, the Inquisition was a catch-all tool for the Spanish authorities to prosecute anything done in private and not in public eye. The Spanish Inquisition has become infamous, rightly so, for its brutal use of torture and violence. But in the context of medieval Europe, it really wasn't that bad. It tried overall about 150,000 people. And of those 150,000, only about 4,000 were actually executed, which is fewer than were executed for witchcraft alone in countries like France or Germany. What the conflict against the Muslims in the Reconquista and the formation of the Inquisition have in common is this protection of Spain against non-Roman Catholic thought. And that really did have an impact on Christianity throughout the world. Because the simple reality is that Portugal and Spain, on the back of technological advances by the Muslims who were in Spain, were the first to cross the Atlantic and founded vast empires. Empires where Christianity would again be brutally enforced. And by cross the Atlantic, I'm of course referring towards South America, not the Vikings going over to the north and not really settling. The fact that South America is Roman Catholic is a direct impact of the Reconquista. And this is true as well for the Roman Catholic impact in parts of Africa, in India and Asia. All of this ties back to the Reconquista. The Reconquista also plays a heavy role in Iberian national and regional identity, and it's been heavily used by the far right throughout the 20th century, including under figures like Franco. Let's just take a moment at this halfway point to look at some maps to help us visualise the Reconquista and sum up most of what I've just been saying. In 750 AD we have the Umayyad Caliphate ruling essentially all of the Iberian Peninsula and across into southern France, apart from this small coastal region in the north, the Kingdom of Asturias. But over time things began to change, and in 1031 it looked more like this. There's a few things to note here. The Kingdom of Leon, the Kingdom of Castile, you have Navarre, you have Aragon, you have Catalonia, and the Muslims are split into various smaller kingdoms known as taifas. This is one of the periods where they were broken down into various smaller warlords, making the conquest by the Christians a fair bit easier. So, what happens next? Well, we come across to about the year 1200, and here we can see once again that actually it's a single Muslim entity controlling the south of Spain and indeed most of North Africa, but we now also have the Kingdom of Portugal, Leon, Castile, Navarre and Aragon, which is growing. The Almohads were a much more aggressive fundamentalist Muslim power controlling at this time. But they would ultimately lose, and by the year 1300 we can see that things have changed even more. Gone is the Kingdom of Leon, combined into the Kingdom of Castile following the crusade by Castile and Portugal against them because they allied with the Muslims, and much more power in the Kingdom of Aragon. And you can see how the union of these two powers would lead to the foundation of modern-day Spain, with the final area of Muslim control finally being kicked out towards the end of the 1400s. But Iberia wasn't the only part of modern Europe forged by Christian crusading and conquest, and so now we turn to the Baltics. Speaking of far-right motifs and crusades, this is another area where these kind of things come to the fore. The Northern Crusades, or the Baltic Crusades, were a series of crusades, Christian colonisation and other military campaigns in the north of Europe against the pagans and to some extent Eastern Orthodox Christians based in the Republic of Novgorod. It's in these crusades that the Teutonic Order came to fame and Prussia first became known as a military powerhouse. It also marked the first of many failed attempts by the West to invade Russia. Some of these crusades were not called by the Pope, some of them were. Some lasted only a short time, and others lasted the best part of 150 years. And these Northern Crusades involved attacks of conquest against a whole range of pagan tribes in Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Prussia, just south of Denmark, and the much larger pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The earliest such crusade was the Norwegian Crusade, led by King Sigurd the Crusader in 1123. He crusaded against a pagan area in southeastern Sweden. Sweden was a Christian kingdom by this time, but that area was still pagan. Like the other crusades in the north, compromise was not really on the table, and those who they fought against were forced to convert. The explicit purpose of these crusades was not to reconquer land which once belonged to Christians, but to force Christianity on the native pagan population at sword point if necessary. And they generally decided that the sword was necessary and easier. The next crusade was the Wendish Crusade of 1147, which occurred around the same time as the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. And this was against pagan tribesmen known as the Wends, who were West Slavs, in modern north and northeastern Germany around Mecklenburg. And this was mainly led by the Danes and the German Saxons, and it had the support of the Pope. The richness of these fertile lands, though, no doubt played a major part in the Wendish Crusade. Indeed, according to contemporary accounts, the only thing the Crusaders really talked about was money and not Jesus. And these crusades were successful in taking lands and encouraging German colonisation. But it didn't really defeat or convert the Wendish people outright. That process would take place over the following centuries without large specific crusades. In the 1150s, it is generally believed that the first Swedish crusade took place against the pagans in southern Finland, but this may be apocryphal and fantasy rather than fact. The second and third Swedish crusades against southern Finland, though, certainly are fact, and they occurred around 1247 and 1293. These crusades cemented the conquest of Christian and Christianization of that region of Finland, which was already underway by the Kingdom of Sweden as it sought to expand its power in the Baltic. Both of those crusades seem to have met with relative success. There were also 3 Danish crusades into Finland, which took place between 1187 and 1202. Which leaves us with what most would consider the 3 key crusades in the north: the Livonian Crusade, the Prussian Crusade, and the Lithuanian Crusade. The Livonian Crusade focused on the land known as Livonia, which is essentially modern-day Estonia and Latvia, the top 2 most of the Baltic states. Stuck between the Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East, this coastal strip of paganism was greatly coveted and pressured. With the failure of peaceful missions throughout the 11th century to convert the population, the Pope decided to just call a crusade and force Christianity upon them in 1195. In 1202, the military religious order, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, were founded in the city of Riga and attracted citizens from across the Holy Roman Empire in great numbers. Over the next 90 years, during which the Brothers of the Sword were merged with the Teutonic Order in 1237, the Crusader kingdom of Livonia expanded against pagan tribes and the territory of the Danes in Estonia till it held total control of the area. Between 1240 and 1242, the Teutonic Knights of the Livonian Order, with the backing of the Pope, tried to take on the Eastern Orthodox Novgorodian Rus, the first major military invasion of Russia by the West. This invasion would end, predictably with our modern hindsight, catastrophically, at the Battle of the Ice in 1242, where the Teutonic Crusaders were soundly defeated upon the icy lake. Though the idea of the ice breaking and the Crusaders drowning is a later invention, first appearing in the Soviet propaganda film of 1938 by Alexander Nevsky. This film was a key piece of propaganda against the rising Nazis, and the battle still plays a key role in Russian nationalism and far-right identity to this day. Whilst the Livonian order focused on the Baltic states, the Teutonic Knights proper, having largely lost control of their areas in the Holy Land, launched the Prussian Crusade between 1217 and 1274, the crusade taking such a long time due to repeated pagan uprisings. With Prussia and Livonia controlled by the Teutonic Order, their sights turned to the final pagan kingdom of significance in Europe, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Starting in 1283, there were annual crusading raids into the duchy, which led to ethnic cleansing, but little territorial gain. The Grand Duchy would finally convert to Christianity, but not due to the Crusaders and their wars, but a political marriage between the Grand Duke and the Queen of Poland, which united their crowns into one. This took place in 1386, but the Teutonic Order was having none of that, and they refused to believe it was valid. And they refused to believe the baptism was a true baptism, and so they launched a new crusade against a united Lithuania-Poland. This crusade was soundly defeated in 1410, and following that the Teutonic Order would fall into decline. The order lost its Prussian territory in 1525 when the Grand Master converted to Lutheranism. That's a Protestant form of the church. The Reformation, we're right on the door of it now. And by 1809 only a single non-military holding remained within Germany, and this was ended by Napoleon in 1810. The Teutonic Order as a common motive is found in German nationalism in the 20th century. Kaiser Wilhelm II posed as a Teutonic knight in front of one of their castles in 1902 as a symbol of imperial policy as the growing German Empire, and the Nazis widely used the Teutonic Knights as a motif in their propaganda. On the other side, though, the Teutonic Knights were seen as the enemy by the Polish and Soviet propaganda makers and serve as representatives of German military nationalism, and in the case of the Soviets, the indestructibility of the Russian war machine, that all people who invade Russia ultimately die in the snow and ice. The Northern Crusades were, as with the main Crusades and the Reconquista, deeply complex campaigns involving a lot of secular power plays, but arguably more so than the others, the Northern Crusades against the pagans majored on violence, ethnic cleansing, forced conversion, and military might to expand their vision of Christendom. The conflict it caused with Novgorod and the Eastern Orthodox Rus would pave the way for nearly a millennia of conflict, which is still being played out today in the war in Ukraine. So as we bring this to a close, let's just try and visualize some of these Northern Crusades. Here we have actually the Second Crusade, which went through Germany and headed down to the Holy Land. But you'll also notice that some of the Second Crusade actually stopped off in Portugal and helped off with the Reconquista. But of importance to us is over here in the north, we have the Wendish Crusade against this northern region of Germany, trying to take control there. And that is the Wendish Crusade, happening at the same time as the Second Crusade. We turn now a few years in the future to 1225 to 1250, and we have the results of the Livonian Crusades against the area of modern-day Estonia and Latvia, and also the Prussian Crusade. And so here on this map we see the Teutonic Order being in control of Prussia, and we see Livonia coming under control of the Teutonic Order as well, although some of it still belongs to Denmark at this point. And here we have the pagan kingdom of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. which brings us to the high point of the Teutonic Order, when it actually controlled a huge amount of land across this region. At the high point of the Order, in 1308 through to 1455, we see the Teutonic Order actually controlled all of this land along the coast, but it was ultimately defeated by the union of Lithuania and Poland when it refused to accept that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania had converted to Roman Catholicism. Well, that ends up our section on the Reconquista and the Northern Crusades, and of course the Crusades in the Holy Land, which really only leaves one final area of crusading during this period, and that is the Crusades which were called against heretics. That's what we're going to turn on to next session, and what will ultimately leave us right at the door of the Protestant Reformation.